I can tell you, I'm extremely excited to kick this panel off and kick our academy off with three extraordinary leaders who are helping to shape the national conversation about the proper education for children in America. Dr. Dawn Williams, who's the Dean of the School of Education at Howard University. Dr. Pedro Naguaro, the Dean of USC's Rossier School of Education, and Dr. Dan Dominique, Executive Director of AASA, the Superintendents Association, have all had illustrious careers in education, and they're continuing to fight for equity, opportunity, and improved quality of life for the children in America. Their bios are going to be in the chat, so I just want to get us started off with Dr. Dominique. So Dr. Dominique, in this time of racial reckoning, superintendents around the country who take a stance on advocating for greater equity and racial justice find themselves being characterized as divisive or even un-American. What advice do you have for leaders who want to push their communities to achieve greater equity as it relates to resource distribution and better academic outcomes for children?
Well, thank you, Sean. I really appreciate starting with an easy question this morning.
Let's jump right in.
This has been an incredible year. There's no question about it. We think about it in terms of not one pandemic. We're all familiar with the COVID pandemic, but we have had a number of crises. We remember that a year ago, last summer, our country was involved not just in dealing with the pandemic, but the tremendous turmoil that was going on as we began to see over and over how the police and the deaths that were involved, where police were involved and Black individuals were involved. And that, along with the pandemic, woke up really a realization that all of us in education have always been aware of, and that's the inequity that exists in our school, the number of our children that have been marginalized over the years and have not received the kind of education that they're entitled to. Many of the reasons why 7 years ago we began this program in terms of wanting to bring into education the kind of leadership that would be very much aware of the issues that our schools are facing, that our children are facing, the need for the minority children in our schools to recognize faces in the leadership that look like them. And today, still, in spite of the work that we have been done, we're very much aware of the fact that just slightly over 4% of our superintendents are superintendents of color. So it's an issue that we as educators have long been aware of and long have been fighting for. What we saw last summer in the midst of the pandemic was a greater awakening and awareness, not just on the part of those of us that have been minorities and have had to deal with this all of our lives, but in terms of our white brethren in the communities, particularly the majority of superintendents that recognized that this was something that had to be done. And so last summer, throughout America, we began to see superintendents who began to provide in their districts cultural awareness programs, that began to provide training for their staffs in recognizing these racial inequity, the systemic racism that existed in our schools, began to introduce into our curriculum acknowledgement of the contributions that had been made by our minorities over the years. And so this started last summer and it began to get headway. As a matter of fact, we as AASA instituted an equity cohort, which grew tremendously over this past year as more and more superintendents and administrators in their districts became involved. Then, of course, we were all part of the issues that we dealt with the previous administration and the impact that that was having in our schools. But then after the events of the election and the events that followed the election, what we began to see was, again, because of the divisiveness that exists in our schools, a very strong pushback this whole issue of critical race theory came up as a defense against the very work that superintendents were doing and trying to do around the country to provide greater awareness on the part of their staffs and in terms of the needs of our children, our minority children in our schools. We have long been proponents of the fact that it's not about equality, it's about equity. It's not about giving all of our students the same thing. It's about giving our students what those students need. We're all aware of the lack of opportunities that exists in so many of our school districts, where our students are marginalized and not provided the opportunities to develop, the opportunity for the kind of excellent education that they need. So we were very proud of the work that was happening in our schools. And all of a sudden, it was like running into a brick wall. And what we have seen over the last couple of months is superintendents that have been fired for the work that they have been doing, superintendents that have basically had to quit their job because of the abuse that they were subjected to, the threats that they were being subjected to. And by the way, when you're a superintendent, that's part of the job. You accept the fact that you're going to be criticized. You accept the fact that you're going to be threatened. But what doesn't fall into that equation is your family. And when superintendents begin to have their families threatened and their families abused, that was a whole different story. So I have seen a rash of departures on the part of superintendents this year that I have not seen in the 14 years that I have been executive director of AASA. Excellent leaders who were not eligible to retire, but just quit because they couldn't handle it. They didn't want to anymore because they were afraid not just for themselves, but for their families. So this is where we are today. We are in an environment where individuals are afraid to speak out. Individuals are afraid to admit that there's systemic racism in our schools. Individuals are afraid to create the opportunities for the students that need that opportunity. So what can we do? Well, there are several things that can be done. You can't make change if you're not in the position to make the change. So if you're a superintendent in a district where that situation is developing, you have to really assess and read where your community is and where your board is at. It would be wonderful if you happen to be in a community where you have community support for the equity issue, and you have a board that's willing to support that equity issue. In that situation, that's wonderful. And you can proceed full speed ahead with the work that you're doing. If you're in a different environment, if you're in an environment where the opposition is great, and by the way, we've all seen in the news the telecasts of board meetings that are turning violent. We all see the script that individuals have gotten on the issue of critical race theory that come up and read it. We at AASA are now being accused of being supporters and part of this CRT issue. If that's the kind of environment that you're in, you have to take a different approach. Because again, if you're not in the leadership position, you're not going to be able to make the changes. If in that kind of an environment, then the best thing to do is to take a step back, not necessarily be as vocal as you might ordinarily want to be, but continue to do the work. Because the reality is that prior to the CRT being brought up, nobody knew what CRT was. Nobody has seen, I have in my years in education, and it's been over 50, did I ever see CRT as part of a school curriculum. It doesn't exist. It's an excuse that's being used. So you go back, and what you do is that you continue to provide the opportunity for your students in your district. You continue to push the equity agenda, but you don't refer to it as something that's being done in terms of marginalizing white students, marginalizing white supremacists, or any of that other area. Ultimately, though, I'm going to finish, Sean.
Sure. Yeah.
Ultimately, though, the bottom line is that you are the champions for children in your communities. And it's your responsibility to stand for them and do the very best that you can to make sure that equity continues. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, Dr. Damish, I think you made some great points, particularly, martyrdom isn't a good strategy. You've got to be in the, you have to be in the actual arena to make change. And also, I agree with you that vocabulary and the language that you choose and your how is important. That even though people are pushing us to be afraid to tackle issues of equity, it's our jobs and our moral responsibility to do it. But the how is important, and that's where we hope through the Howard program and the USC program that we can give people the better how to be able to execute. I definitely want to move on to Dean Williams here. As we know, Howard has received much attention in recent years, I think, as the nation looks in this moment of racial reckoning, and they look to places such as Howard that have been dealing with the work to make a better, more just, more equitable America for people of color since its inception. So my question to you is, if there were a Black and Brown agenda for schooling in America, what should be some of the essential areas of focus? And a part B would be, how could Howard School of Education strengthen the voice of Black leadership related to the schooling of children in America?
Hey, great. Thank you, Dr. Joseph, and good morning and welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here this morning, but it's always wonderful to spend time with those connected to the Urban Superintendent Academy. I always feel like it's a wonderful start to a new school year, both on the academic side at the university, but then also, of course, in our K-12 arena. So I always heavily agree with many parts of what my colleagues are speaking about. They know the challenges. We know this is a challenging time that we are in. Also part of opportunities. If you are signing up to be a superintendent, you are aware of the challenges. I first want to just also provide major kudos to those in leadership, really at any level at this point, because it is a difficult time to be a leader. And to know and to find your community, because you need support during this leadership journey, particularly at this time. But first, let me start off by saying programs like the Urban Superintendent Academy certainly help to strengthen the voice of Black leadership. And while Howard has historically been known to have the ear of Black America, we really deserve the attention of all of America when it comes to the education of Black and Brown children. We promote public-facing scholarship. So our faculty are engaged in teaching, research, and service. But we are particularly poignant about public-facing scholarship. And what I mean by that is the research that we do, we ensure that it gets to the general public. And what my faculty have done, they have presented nationally across the country on culturally affirming content, pedagogy, counseling, and leadership practices. We are actually working to create an advocacy center, because from what I have noticed that our faculty are everywhere nationally and very highly sought after in these particular areas. However, we lack the systematic approach. So we're working to create an advocacy center, one that will be educational oriented, service oriented, and of course will serve the academic and school community in pedagogical and human service arenas. Now, relating to a Black and Brown agenda of schooling, this is something that we've been talking about for quite some time, but I think we now have greater attention of what should be a Black and Brown agenda. And I must say that it has to start with focusing on equity oriented. It's really a plan that eliminates present inequities and race-based disparities. We have to start with switching the accountability. We are currently operating from what I consider to be a deficit perspective. And here are some examples that I think that you're going to recognize, and examples that were cited by Rashad Robinson from Color of Change Consortium. Notice how we focus on reentry programs instead of the focus of ending mass incarceration. How we focus on mortgage loan disparities instead of the banking practices that help to produce these outcomes. How we have been having campaigns to provide water bottles to Flint, Michigan, instead of cleaning and changing the pipes. How we focus on the statistics of Black students not graduating from high school, rather than focusing on the failure of our system that is causing that disparity. So as an educator, you all know if 80% of your students fail an exam, what do? You assess your instructions. So as leaders, we know the impact of a systems approach, focusing on fixing systems, not people. We have to examine the rules that are manufacturing the problems that we obviously are seeing. So what Dan mentioned earlier, when doing so, we have to be strategic about how we plan to approach it. These are structural problems, and you cannot have charitable solutions to structural problems. We have to continue to push, agitate, and advocate. What the Urban Superintendent Academy will do for you all is to help you provide those tools. We have a very clear understanding of what we're working with and what we're working against. However, you're going to have to look at your own community context and figure out the strategy to best approach these type of solutions. But the plan has to be one that is really getting rid of these racial-based disparities.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Noguera, I mean, you have spent your career educating the world on how to, looking at your research on how to best support Black and Brown children and move us forward. As you think about the work that these future aspiring urban superintendents plan on doing, what advice would you give them as they work to create more equitable schools? And again, same question, how can USC best support leaders in dealing with such challenges?
Thanks for the question, Sean, and good morning, everyone. Great to be with you, part of this program. Glad to see it's still going strong since 2015. Been thinking a lot about that because it's so clear to me that simply providing a degree, an EDD, in ed leadership is not enough. That so many of the challenges that our leaders are going to face, we don't adequately prepare you in graduate school. If you go back to the conversation that Dan was started on, this controversy around critical race theory, and we're seeing superintendents get eaten alive in this controversy. As a university, we have to ask, how did we help to prepare them for this controversy? Because many of them are not skilled in communication, not skilled at dealing with the backlash. And so I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we need to be ongoing partners for leaders. That is, it's not good enough to send them out there and wish them luck. We need to still be a part of their work. And we're looking into how we can do that as a university to stay connected to the people that are in the field, that are on the front lines, that need thought partners. And I know AASA has been doing that. I believe universities have a role to play in that. I was asked recently by some superintendents about this critical race theory, and as Dan pointed out, there's not a single school district in the country that teaches critical race theory. So this is a total farce, right? The whole thing. Nonetheless, it's a controversy. It's a well thought out political ploy. And I try to remind people, you have to take the high road and speak to the values, that values of equity. There's not a single district in the country that says we're only going to educate certain kids. So then how do we make sure we're in fact educating all kids? And where's the evidence? Teaching our history is in the standards. There's not a single state in the country that says you can't teach about slavery. So what are they trying to do? Whitewash our history? That's a totalitarian strategy that's used in countries that are actively trying to deny their own history. So I think we have to really work with our graduates, with the folks that we have supported. How do we maintain the high road so that we can stay focused on the work, even as there are these efforts to try to distract us and prevent us from doing the work? And then I think issues like accountability that have been so distorted over the last 20 years. We've been fed this idea that accountability is top down. It's based on student test scores. And the people who are most accountable are those with the least power, namely the kids and the teachers. That's a real problem. Accountability has to be mutual. Everyone in the system, from the superintendent to the board, ideally the governor, the state legislature, the teacher, the parent, the student, the custodian, the receptionist, everyone's got to be accountable. What are they accountable for? How do we make sure our systems are responsive to the needs of our kids and the needs of our community? I was in a district a few years ago, and the superintendent asked me to work with his principals around these disparities, racial disparities. And he pointed out to me, he said, you know, every one of our teachers is rated satisfactory or exemplary. And we have these so many kids, the evidence shows are not learning. What do you make of that? I said, I make of that you are all complicit as a system in the failure of those children. Now, he didn't expect me to say that, because when I say you are all, that included him, because he's part of the system too. You know, if you see kids failing and the adults act like they had nothing to do with it, what does that tell us? It tells us that we don't take ourselves seriously enough to ensure that kids really get the opportunity to learn. The alternative is not to blame. Blame is not a strategy for improvement. The alternative is to be really clear. How do we get the evidence that we're meeting the needs of kids? How do we create the conditions in our schools that allow our teachers to do the best work? How do we get parents to really be involved so they understand their job is not simply to send us their kids. They have to reinforce the learning at home. They have to make those kids get to school. And we know that during the pandemic, if parents weren't involved, their kids weren't involved. So we have to use this moment of reopening as a way to reimagine some of the things that we've been doing, because so much of what we've been doing has not worked. We cannot go back to the status quo. The status quo is killing us. We need a generation of leaders that are willing to disrupt the status quo and do things differently. And so I'm glad that AASA is leading this, and because I think that it's time to shake it up and not go back to what we've been doing.
Thank you so much. And participants, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and we can get some of your questions to these powerful thought leaders. So I'm going to go back to Dr. Dominique and say, from your national viewpoint, what do you see as the greatest 2 or 3 issues superintendents must overcome in this current moment? You're on mute.
Famous last words, you're on mute. So definitely at this point in time, and we heard some of this from Bernadine when she was talking, the number one the priority for superintendents right now is getting kids back to school safely. And that's the key thing here. And again, we're seeing the tremendous disruption that's going on in our country, and in an issue that you're basically having politics on one side and the science on the other. We all understand that the number one prevention against this pandemic is the vaccine. So getting our kids vaccinated, those that are older, 12 years and older, is important. And many of our superintendents have been doing clinics this summer to do that. We also understand that the half of our student population are elementary age students that are below 12. There is no vaccine. So the number one protection for them is wearing masks. So getting our students vaccinated, getting our students to wear masks is a priority. But we see around the country right now, governors that are basically forbidden districts to ensure that their students are wearing masks in all of their classrooms. We also see, again, and we're going to have a panel later on this afternoon of superintendents that are standing up to that challenge and being champions for children. Michael Hinojosa in Dallas is a great example of that. I'm so great that Michael is going to be on that panel. He took on the governor in Texas and says, my kids are going to be masked no matter what. So that is definitely important right now. That's the number one battle. The number two, and I'm not going to go into detail because I spoke about it, is the whole issue of equity. Here again, we can't take a step back. We have to continue moving forward, being strategic, but definitely the equity issue cannot take a step back. It has to continue moving forward. And last, of course, is that, and we're working with districts, we've created a committee on the American Rescue Plan of superintendents to help districts to spend that money and to spend that money wisely. And boy, over the years, one of the excuses for the lack of equity has always been lack of money. Well, we would do this if we had the money. Oh, we would do that if we have the money. Well, now you have the money. So now it's a great opportunity for system leaders and school districts to use that money, okay, to provide opportunities for all of their children. So those are the three key areas right now that I think are important for our superintendents.
Thank you. That's great insight. And Dean Williams, as you think about this past year and how different it has been, and how superintendents and boards have really had to pivot to address the needs of students, how has this moment changed your thinking on what we should be doing to prepare future superintendents?
I'm going to actually pick up a little bit on what Dan has said in his previous comments here. But overall, it really feels like we are solving problems anchored on a moving target. He said that the superintendent should be spending the money that they're receiving, because we are fortunate to be getting this money to really address some of these current problems and spend it wisely. So my advice in the preparation and preparing superintendents is how to do that. Fiscal leadership is sometimes an issue with management within particularly larger school districts. So I'm going to advise that you don't plan the budget, you should be budgeting your plan. And I want to push this issue on equity. We have seen the emergence or even the greater visibility of DEI initiatives. By DEI, I'm talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the way that I see DEI is diversity is the what, equity is the why, and inclusion is the how. So looking at it from that perspective and pushing our issues of equity forward, there is no excuse if you are developing this plan of equity, you instead budget that plan instead of trying to figure out how you're going to fit equity in. So in our preparation of superintendents, I think that needs to be in a really keen focus. And I also want to speak a little bit about what Pedro mentioned around superintendents being comfortable, being prepared, and understanding critical race theory. At Howard University, this is one area where we take significant pride. This is something that our undergraduates are aware of prior to the controversy that exists. This is something that I want to encourage all of my higher education colleagues and leaders to ensure that there's an understanding of this theoretical research-based framework and its distinction of teaching about race and racism in schools. So there's a lot of education that needs to be had. Some of it is very particular to our times, but all of it is something that can assist with the sustainability of the position, even far beyond 20 years from now, the issues that we're dealing with right now.
Thank you. Michael Essien, who's one of the members in our group here, asked the question, and I'll open it to anyone to answer. How do we build new systems in districts that are entrenched in doing what they've always been? And so I think that's the challenge. As we're entering, many districts were trying to get back to the old way, and as Dr. Noguera communicated, the old way wasn't working for many kids. So how do we help them have new conceptual frameworks of what can be, and instead of being stuck on the way things always had been?
I'll jump in. So one thing, and it's important. I heard my colleague, I think it's Luis Gomez, UCLA, say this. He said, "Our schools were perfectly designed to get the results they get now." Right, think about that. So if you simply do more of what you've been doing, you're going to continue to get the same results. The real question is, where do you have to make changes to get better results? That requires an ability to see the whole system and understand how it works. And that's what our superintendents have to be able to do. They have to not only see the system they lead, they have to understand the communities they work in and the needs of those children and families. That ability to have that kind of vision is something that I think is really essential for leaders who are going to make a difference. I want to go back to the question Dawn raised about the money. It's so good, that schools have money now. I mean, this is an unusual time we're in because we've never been in a time where there's just so much. But if you simply put more money into what you've been doing, you can't expect different results. And there are a lot of superintendents that I know, because they've said to me, I had a superintendent said, I have more money now to help kids in foster care. I don't know what to spend it on. I think he was being honest. We have to identify high leverage strategies that the research has shown will lead to change. I'll give you an example. Providence, Rhode Island. Providence has been one of the most dysfunctional urban districts in the country for the last 30 years. They can't keep a superintendent. It's a mess. They just experienced in a year the biggest gains in literacy that they've ever seen. Literacy across the curriculum works. When you train every teacher, regardless of what subject they teach, on how to teach literacy, when you get more kids reading, more kids writing, you know what happens? Literacy improves. Wow, is that a shocker? It's not even high tech, right? This is old, but it's focused. It's focused on student needs. So much of what we've done is not focused, and we have not been attentive to the quality of our interventions. We try all kinds of things, but we don't evaluate to make sure we did it right. We don't look at the data to see, did it work? And so we got to stop spinning our wheels. We've got to start being much more evidence-focused, and we've got to try to understand how our systems work to produce these inequities, because that's the part we have to face up to. We are complicit in the reproduction of those inequities.
And if I may, Pedro, to this point, Mort, I don't know if your intentions or if you already have shared with the cohort the paper that our commission that we put together in terms of student-centered equity-focused education. But this past January, we brought together a commission of 30 individuals, superintendents, philanthropists, business community leaders, and we challenged them to put together a redesign of our educational system, to Pedro's point of view, not to continue to do what we've always done, but to make the changes to make the difference. And that paper outlines what these points are. And as the title of it would suggest, student-centered equity-focused education. And to date, we have over 100 superintendents in districts across America that have signed on to be part of this project. And we anticipate that by next year, we will have over 200. And what we hope to do is to get the kind of demonstration districts that are available in terms of the work that they're doing, focusing on equity, making the changes that we're talking about, making the difference, and not continuing to do what we've always done. So we're trying to turn words into action by beginning to see a growing number of school districts across America making the changes, doing the work they need to do. And we are providing them with support to do that work, as well as a lot of foundations that are coming on board and providing us with the support to be able to work with districts to do that. So again, yes, our intention at AASA is to act, to make the difference, to make the changes.
And thank you. And Jessica's put in the chat, the Learning 2025 student-centered, equity-focused, future-driven education that everyone on this call should read, as it'll give you a deep insight into where we should be moving, as a nation. But I want to go back and ask this question, because the pandemic has given us an opportunity, if you will, to reset as it relates to accountability measures, as many school districts across the country, haven't administered tests, state tests in recent years. What accountability measures should superintendents be focusing on, superintendents and boards really be focusing on coming out of the pandemic to help communities redefine what constitutes a quote unquote good school, particularly for Black and Brown children?
Well, let me jump in very quickly on that. Here again, you're right. It is a great opportunity, and assessment is necessary in order for us to have that kind of information. We know that one of the we fought hardly against No Child Left Behind because of the focus on standardized testing and using those tests, and what that did to a large extent is to draw the attention to performance on math and reading and all of those. And we know what that resulted. Right now, the opportunity with the learning loss that has resulted in terms of the pandemic is to move into the assessment of each child and take that assessment of where that child is at and begin to move that child forward from that point. We hear from some of our elected officials promoting that what we should simply do is have every child repeat the same grade level. That's a perfect example of continuing to do what we've always done. That has never worked. Okay, but to move children from the point that they're at forward, to personalize learning, to provide our students with the kind of attention that they need, and to provide them with the opportunities to make excellent programs available to all of our students, and not be subject to testing into the program. And if they don't qualify, they don't get that quality education. Those are the kind of changes that we need to make. This is the perfect opportunity to do it. We're trying to work with the Secretary of Education to do that, to emphasize that and allow us to move forward.
Can I add something? I just would build on what Dan just said. Stay focused on the work. Stay focused on the evidence of meeting student needs, not just the academic needs, because you also have to address those social and emotional needs, psychological, mental health needs. But my friend Michael Essien is on there, and he posed a question a while ago, and he's in San Francisco. And I just have to call out San Francisco for this is the kind of stuff you don't want to do. They spent weeks debating about a mural that was hanging up in a high school. Meanwhile, Black children in that district are not being well served. This is the kind of distraction that prevents us from doing the work. So if you're a leader in a district like that, stay focused on what you were hired to do. You were not hired to put up murals. You were hired to make sure kids are learning. And I know that it's easier said than done, but part of what being a leader at this time requires is clarity of purpose. And it's the distractions that are killing us.
Let me also add to that. We are at sort of an inflection point, a pivotal time in our educational careers about the focus on education, the focus on schools. We have the attention of all of America. Particularly, we have the attention of families and parents. Let us not forget that many parents were co-educating children during this pandemic, got a chance to recognize and realize how hard it was to be an educator, to really fill the needs of children. So we have their ears now. So along with that attention, we have to exercise that courage. And many times you all hear me talk about not just courage in your strength, courage as far as political courage to do what is right. And we have to be repetitive around that. I am a strong proponent of systems-based reform. We can't just work in silos of where we're trying to improve. You must be able to touch certain areas. And if you are particularly keen on one particular area in the system that you want to reform, that's fine if you feel like that's going to go a long way, making sure evaluation is attached to that, but you have to be in other areas as well. It cannot be in a siloed effect.
And a final question from the field. Afi asked about the notion of how do you create a sense of urgency to do right at this moment? Because right now, it's many superintendents who have urgency and boards who have urgency that move forward and create the system of change don't do a great job managing that change, and things kind of fall apart. And that's the difficult challenge that any superintendent and board faces. Like how much change do you push in the system, and how do you manage that change? Any thoughts from you on best approaches to manage change and create a sense of urgency to actually affect and monitor that change that's happening?
Well, I'll start with saying a little something, and I'll use my own examples of leadership. I consider myself to be a measured thinker, and I think that's the approach that's going to be wise, is creating the goals and creating timelines against those goals, and then have clear benchmark points of assessment to look at those goals and communicate along the way. So all this is strategic planning. All of this is knowing and understanding your audience, knowing and understanding communication strategies with that audience. So if there are ways, and I hope that within the session, as we're about to embark on our 7th cohort, where we're talking about strategic planning, please think of yourself as a measured thinker, where you see the big picture, but you have clear benchmarks along the way to measure progress that would allow you to be able to assess to see, do I still need to go down this path or go through another path?
And I think, again, that the pandemic has created a great opportunity for change because we've been subjected to so much change. Think about it. Seat time requirements was blown out of the air. I mean, this past year, if you were a high school student, you were never in your seat. You were at home. The school calendar is gone. All of these traditions of the school as we know it have been busted up by the pandemic. So it provides a great opportunity for us to be able to provide the additional and focused instruction that our students need and opportunities by taking advantage of online learning, not just as an excuse for when the kids can't attend school because of the pandemic, but to continue to provide instruction to their students after in-person instruction in the school day, during vacation periods, during the summer months. Tutoring, there are dollars available in the ARP for districts to be able to assign tutors to work with youngsters that need the additional attention. The opening up of opportunities that were not there when districts had programs that were exclusive rather than inclusive. And that basically excluded our students out of it. So this pandemic is a great opportunity to take advantage of it and to be able to provide the kinds of programs that in the past, tradition would have said, well, you can't do that because of all of these rules and regulations that exist.
Dr. Nagura, final thoughts on managing change in this moment and creating that, how do you create that sense of urgency, but also manage the change? Because again, there's whenever you push, there's a pushback that comes. And I think that's what's really, knocking a lot of superintendents out of the park in this moment.
What I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that we need to make sure that our students and staff feel supported right now. Many people are afraid still about coming back. And in many districts, particularly the urban districts, there are families that don't want to send their kids back still. And the evidence shows that just because reopening schools is not like turning on a faucet, they just suddenly appear again. People are reluctant, they want to know is it safe. So I right now would say focus on welcoming people back, taking care of people, making it a joyful experience to be back. Because I worry that if we launch into addressing learning loss, that may have the opposite effect than what we want. I think we want to make the return to school something that's pleasurable. And then as we start to rebuild a sense of community, then really focus in on the work. But this might, to build on what Dawn just said, be more measured, because I think if we just launch it being urgency, we might step over people and there may be nobody following you. So you need to be careful that you're bringing your community, you're bringing your staff along, because there are we're already seeing the pushback in many communities about the reopening of schools.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we give our esteemed panel a round of applause? Thank you all so much for your wisdom, your insight, and your continued support, not just to our cohorts, but to America. Your leadership is welcomed and needed at this time. So thank you all for being with us today.